Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. If we don't think our fellow citizens are capable of making the right choices about what we eat and drink, how can we expect them to be able to vote? Since researcher Chris Berg presented his 2015 FODI talk, this question rings eerily true to what many individuals are experiencing today. In an era of pandemics, vaccinations and lockdowns, who is best placed to make the decisions for us? We the people or the state? Please enjoy the 2015 FODI session, Nanny State, with Chris Berg.
Just about finished my doctorate, all right. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I flew up this morning from Melbourne and I'm flying back tonight, so it's a really in and out, but it's very kind that you've all come to hear about this provocative topic. The great American writer H.L. Mencken thought that Australia's best contribution to the English language was the word wowser. Now, unfortunately for us, the origins of the word wowser are very obscure. At the turn of the 20th century, some self-identified wowsers said that it stood for, quote, "we only want social evils remedied." Now, back then, the wowsers were concerned about the social evils of drinking, gambling, the theatre, dancing, mixed-sex bathing, and cremation. I'm not sure why either. Today's wowsers, or today's nanny staters, are concerned about the health consequences of drinking, gambling, drug taking, overeating, advertising, going out too late, and visiting naughty websites. Australia is a nanny state. It always has been. We're one of the richest countries in the world, but we're also one of the most paternalistic towards our own citizens. Australian councils use their powers of planning to ban trans fats from restaurants. Australia was the first in the world to strip colours and logos from tobacco products. Under the banner of income management, the Australian government controls the spending of welfare recipients. We persist in our war on drugs despite a century of failure. The Rudd government's Preventative Health Task Force in 2009 even proposed regulating the portion size of restaurant servings. That same government wanted to censor the internet with a mandatory filter to protect us from extreme sexual content. So, let me get some throat clearing though out of the way. A lot of people don't like the phrase nanny state. I've read academic papers dismissing it as an easy phrase in the same tradition as health Nazi, conjuring up unfairly Big Brother and George Orwell. I've read claims in newspapers that the phrase is part of a gendered narrative to attack the Gillard government as, quote, big butch bitches. I'm glad I got that out right. So I don't want you today, though, to get too caught up in the connotations of the phrase nanny state. So I'm going to talk about the nanny state interchangeably with its formal description used by philosophers and economists and ethicists, paternalism, which, of course, if you think about it, is also a gendered word, but it's the one that scholars use, so it must be okay. What do we mean by paternalism? Lots of things get bundled up as nanny state, as I'm sure you've seen, but I want to be specific. The philosopher John Kleinig formally defines paternalism as a situation in which X acts to diminish Y's freedom to the end that Y's good may be secured. I'll spell that out simpler for you. That is, an outside person, say the government, prevents you from doing something you want to do for your own benefit. Let's call X Jack, and let's call Y Jill. When Jack prevents Jill from harming another person, that's not paternalism. When Jack prevents Jill from harming herself, that is paternalism. Oh yes, in this story, Jack is the Minister for Health. The nanny state, such as it is an approach to government where paternalism is the norm rather than the exception, where politicians, policymakers, bureaucrats, public health activists and Jack seek to limit freedom for our own benefit. I'm going to make a few arguments today against the nanny state. The first one is practical. Does Jack really know what is in Jill's best interest? This is harder to answer than it might seem. The second argument I'm going to make is philosophical. What is Jill's best interest? The third one, and the most important one, though, is ethical. What right does Jack have to restrict Jill's freedom, even if he does know what Jill's best interest is? As this suggests, underpinning the nanny state debate is a much deeper and more important debate about the relationship between the state and the citizen, the limits or otherwise of democratic government, and how we should think about our fellow Australians. Fundamentally, my question is this: if we don't think people are capable of making decisions about what they eat and drink, then why do we think they are capable of voting? Or let me reverse it. We believe, everyone in this room, as Democrats, that people have the right to choose their vote unimpeded by any higher authority. This is a fundamental liberty. It's the most important decision we make as citizens. It can have very real consequences for other people. Yet we believe it is an absolute moral right we have. We would be extremely offended if someone presumed to override our political choice. Then why aren't we similarly offended when we are told what we can and cannot do with our own bodies? The widespread acceptance of paternalism is, in my view, a leading indicator of a broader anti-democratic ethos which is harming our democracy. I'll return to that. Let me throw in one last caveat. What I'm not going to do today is try to argue about whether nanny state policies work. It's obvious that if you apply enough pressure, governments can change the behaviour of their citizens. If you raise taxes on fatty foods enough, people will consume less of them. People respond to incentives. But sometimes people respond to incentives in very strange ways. For instance, some studies have found that calorie labelling at fast food restaurants have actually encouraged people to consume unhealthier food, as those people use the labels to identify the most calories they could buy for their dollar. The system works. Now, of course, nobody suggests that these calorie labels are some great constraint on our freedom. They're known as soft paternalism, and they're less objectionable because of that. But this example underlines why some of even the most benign sounding regulations designed to help us from ourselves can have some very unfortunate consequences, at least from the perspective of people who want calorie counts to encourage healthy eating. But today I want you to see the nanny state not as a collection of diverse policies, but as an approach to government and legislation that limits our choices for our own good. The basic arguments for the nanny state will be fairly familiar to you. They're certainly very persuasive and they're widely shared. They're intuitive, they accord with our own personal experiences. It is simply this: we do not always make the best decisions. We do not always know what is best for us. We drink too much, we eat too much, we make mistakes. We buy things we don't want. We regret our actions. Many of these mistakes are predictable. As we grow older, we learn about our own frailties. I eat too much. Thank you for being polite about that. And I can tell you exactly what foods I'm most susceptible to overeating. In the last decade or so, these intuitive observations have been given a firm intellectual foundation through the field of behavioural economics. Behavioural economics looks at the specific cognitive biases and errors that make us make irrational decisions. For instance, we underestimate the future consequences of our actions, we employ wishful thinking, we can be swayed by evocative imagery or language, we stereotype, we discount information, and we focus on information that confirms our beliefs. We are awful at calculating risk. We are fantastic at rationalising our own behaviour. It's been long understood in alcohol research, for instance, that people underreport how much alcohol they consume. This isn't because they're deliberately lying, it's because they're discounting how much they drink. Other mental errors we make are caused by a lack of information. We might not know what we're doing is bad for us. We might underestimate the health risks of our own behaviour. Some of these errors are very predictable. Paternalism and the nanny state tries to fix them. Where there's a lack of information, the government can step in and provide that information. Where we make systemically biased decisions, the government can step in to nudge those decisions towards better ones, or even prevent those decisions being made in the first place. Here's my first problem with this line of reasoning. It's true that we all suffer from cognitive errors. Some of those are predictable, but so do the bureaucrats and politicians who might correct those errors. There's an economist called Harold Demsetz, and he spoke of the nirvana fallacy. It's easy to identify problems in society. It's also easy to imagine solutions to those problems if, and only if, you also imagine that those solutions can be implemented by a government that is benevolent, neutral, all-knowing, apolitical, and all-powerful. To try to illustrate this point, another economist, Gordon Tullock, used to tell a story of a Roman emperor judging a singing competition. In this competition, there were two entrants. The first sung their song. It wasn't great. It was off-key. Some of the words were a bit blurred. But the emperor immediately called the competition to a halt and declared victory for the second singer, as they couldn't be worse. I trust you see the emperor's error here. The grass is always greener on the other side. But no perfect alternative to personal choice exists. Governments are not benevolent, politically neutral, all-knowing and all-powerful. Governments are made of people. I know that's very shocking to hear. Some of those people are politicians. Some of them are bureaucrats. They have flaws, cognitive and behavioural. Some of those flaws are predictable. And those flaws should make us think twice about the desirability of the nanny state. Let me briefly take you through a couple of those flaws because I think they're important. We humans have the tendency to overreact in the face of risk. This is known as action bias. It's particularly true when we see someone else who has a problem, who doesn't have the urge to help a loved one, even if we're not totally sure what that loved one needs. Action bias is a basic human trait. Applied to government, though, action bias means that politicians and bureaucrats will favour intervention, even irrational intervention. As a politician, of course, not acting brings very few political rewards, but there are many political rewards for bold statements that you have a plan to tackle some social problem. Action bias is why the federal government passes around 7,000 pages of legislation every single year. It's why no press conference can go by without an announceable, one of the worst words in the English language. And it's why politicians seem to derive more benefit from proposing legislation than actually solving problems. A second cognitive bias is called motivated reasoning. Here we rationalise evidence in order to make that evidence conform to our own beliefs. We all do this. There's no point pretending we don't. So do our political and bureaucratic betters. They have preferences about how the world should be, well-formed or not, and they seek out evidence to support those preferences. A third cognitive error is known as the focusing illusion. Social problems are complicated, with many overlapping causes, but the focusing illusion encourages us to obsess about single factors that we can manipulate and dismiss or downplay the importance of those factors we cannot. The last cognitive error I'll mention common to government actors is the illusion of competence. This is one of the most widely attested psychological phenomenons in people in positions of power or authority, overconfidence in their own abilities. Now, I don't mean this as an attack on public servants. We have all the exact same flaws. Public servants and politicians are exactly as motivated by selfishness and selflessness as everyone else. They are as informed as everyone else. Where they differ is that the decisions that they make are explicitly made on behalf of others. And in the case of nanny state policies, they make decisions in order to impose their own idea of what's good on us. But how do they know what is good? How do they know that their decision-making is superior to the people those decisions will affect? Jeremy Bentham put it this way: "It is a standing topic of complaint that a man knows too little of himself. Be it so. But why is it so certain that the legislator must know more?" The philosopher Sarah Conley tries to answer this in her book Against Autonomy. She argues that the fact there is a distance between the paternalist and the citizen means that the paternalist is able to make more clear-eyed decisions on our behalf. The argument goes like this: we as citizens are likely to be blinded by our emotions and desires when we're sitting opposite a lovely, unhealthy slice of cake. The paternalist, however, looking on from afar, has unclouded faculties and can make better decisions about whether to consume that cake. But that distance between the paternalist and the citizen has its own challenges. Hence my second objection, the philosophical one. How do we know what is in someone's own good? This might seem like quite a simple question to answer. We'd all rather be healthy. We'd all like to live long lives. But then we'd all also like to eat the cake. We'd like to skip the gym. Most of us prefer television to chin-ups. Life is about trade-offs, and those trade-offs aren't binary. We all place different weights on health and hedonism. There is no right answer. I should go to the gym more, but I'd also like to spend more time with my family and indulge in my favourite foods. Smoking, drinking, gambling, overindulging. These things all bring pleasure. They also all bring benefits, as well as they bring costs. The case for abstaining from these pleasures is not clear-cut. It is not a slam dunk. Paternalists cannot assume that their own preferences, for instance, prioritising health over hedonism, are shared by the rest of the population. We all have a different taste for risk. This makes the paternalist job a lot more complicated. Because the choice they have to make, the question they have to face is not how to ensure people make healthy choices. We might not want to make healthy choices. Rather, they have to divine what our choices would be if we were not subject to all those cognitive errors. If we weren't hopelessly distorted by our weak wills, if we weren't overconfident, if we weren't ignorant, if we weren't time inconsistent. In other words, would you still eat the cake if you weren't cake crazy? In their influential book, Nudge, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler try to deal with this objection. Sunstein and Thaler define good paternalism as influencing choices to make better off, quote, as judged by themselves. The trick here for them is to ask people whether their decisions are good in retrospect. But it's not totally clear to me why our retrospective preferences are superior to our current ones. Who says our future selves have a veto over the choices we make right now? After all, our future self is as irrational as we are. Not all regret is rational. On the other hand, we often give ourselves credit for things we had little hand in. Surveying this thicket of conceptual problems, the philosopher Daniel Haussmann concludes there are a few good alternatives to relying on personal preferences or individual judgment of expected benefits. Simply put, Jack has no better way of assessing what Jill prefers than simply observing what she prefers. The emperor should not assume that the second singer is better than the first. My final argument today, though, is the ethical one. Here I want to draw a parallel between our freedom to choose in the political sphere and our freedom to choose in the commercial or consumption sphere. If we believe in moral autonomy in one domain, the absolute right to choose who to vote for, why do we not believe in moral autonomy in the other, the absolute right to choose what we do with our bodies? In my book, Liberty, Equality and Democracy, which you should all buy, I'll just pause for a moment to let that settle. In the book, I argue that democracy is more than a system of voting or a way to affect the peaceful changing of political leaders. It's about more than contestable elections, a free press or accountable government, or even about sausage sizzles. At the heart of democracy, in my view, is the belief that we are all fundamentally equal, with an equal right to social participation. Hence, we have an equal say in who leads the government. But underpinning even that is an assumption that we are all capable of having that say. Hence my claim that the nanny state is undemocratic. It violates a fundamental democratic proposition that we are all capable of making choices on our own behalf in the voting booth as well as at the supermarket. Now, I'm not the first person to make this claim. Critics of democracy have historically been critics of human rationality across the board. Plato's Republic is one of the most important anti-democratic works of philosophy in the Western canon. In the Republic, he describes a hypothetical personification of democratic man. Describes it in this way: someone who sometimes drinks heavily while listening to the flute, at other times drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training, at other times he's idle and neglects everything. Sometimes he even preoccupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. Plato continues. He often engages in politics, leaping up from his seat and saying or doing whatever comes to his mind. If he happens to admire soldiers, he's carried in that direction, if money makers, in that one. Notice two things about that quote. First, Plato's democrat is deeply irrational. He is a rabble of unclear desires. He acts against his own self-interest. He is rich with all those cognitive biases identified by modern scholars. The second thing to notice is Plato's disdain for the democratic man. He drinks either too much or too little. Sometimes he's active and sometimes he's lazy. He even, and this is the horrifying part, has opinions about politics and philosophy. We're so used to reading condemnations of the habits, capabilities, and interests of our fellow citizens. It's nice to feel superior to others, but that feeling is a deeply undemocratic one. And when we presume to use the power of the state to change or manipulate the habits of our fellow citizens, we are being both patronising and oppressive. I began this talk with an observation that much gets thrown into the nanny state pile that does not meet the strict definition of paternalism. Well, there are some other policies which are rarely described as nanny state, but are, in my view, particularly pernicious paternalistic policies. The war on drugs is one. Criminalising drug use shows us how, when taken to its logical extreme, policies which are purportedly to help people can be deeply damaging to those very same people. Drug criminalisation, after all, punishes people for nothing but the choices they make about their own bodies. The second is income management. Income management provides that welfare money can only be spent on approved items. Right now, income management is mainly applied to Indigenous Australians, but there are pilots testing it across the country on Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. Income management is a deeply illiberal paternalism that targets Australia's most vulnerable people. And rather than discouraging welfare dependency, it actually encourages that dependency, treating welfare recipients not as fellow citizens, but as incompetents. Income management is, in my view, a neat encapsulation of the way paternalism is undermining the basic moral equality of all citizens at the heart of our democratic project. And it is one of my explanations for why we are living through what is widely seen as a crisis of democracy. The Lowy Institute poll found that an astonishing 35% of Australians do not agree with Winston Churchill's quip that democracy is preferable to any other system of government. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, that figure is even higher. 51% of Australians, young adult Australians, disagree with Churchill. But no wonder. They have been taught for years that their fellow citizens are incapable of making basic decisions about their own lives. No wonder young Australians are starting to doubt that those otherwise idiotic citizens have the capacity to vote, which is, after all, one of the most complicated information-intensive choices we all face. But I'd like to dwell on the Churchill quip for a moment, because it's a revealing one. Churchill said, and this was his quote in its entirety, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." He made this claim in a parliamentary debate in November 1947. Churchill, as you know, had fought Hitler and was turning his mind to Stalin. But the anti-democracy he was thinking of in that debate wasn't the anti-democracy of fascism or communism. It was the technocratic socialism of Clement Attlee, his parliamentary opponent and now Prime Minister, who was busy nationalising British industries. Pitted against democracy, Churchill saw the Labour Party's, quote, supermen and super planners playing the angel and making the masses of people do what they think is good for them. In other words, Churchill saw that paternalism was anti-democratic, a violation of the democratic idea that we are all morally sovereign. The nanny state gets a lot of things wrong. It is based on a misconception that bureaucrats are unbiased and better informed than citizens. It assumes that people have true preferences unknown to them, but which can be nevertheless discerned by outsiders, and it is a limit on personal freedom of choice. But most importantly, is undemocratic. The nanny state treats citizens as if they are incapable of decision-making in their own interests and proposes to override that decision-making to compensate. Fundamentally, Jack has no right to rule over Jill. Thank you very much.
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House and presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website. Thank you.